Here, in the Mahayana then, in Vipasana, we're saying that things do not exist independently. And the statement is the following. And it's most commonly written like this. Things are empty of inherent existence. So empty of inherent existence is similarly saying things are not independently existent. They lack independent existence. So things are not independently existent. Why? Because they are dependently existent. And the technical word here is dependent arising. The word arising here means coming into existence. So things come into existence dependently. So again, what we're saying is things are not independently existent because they are dependently existent. This phrase here, empty of inherent existence, is emptiness. So emptiness is not saying nothing really exists. Emptiness is simply saying things are empty of independent existence. They're not independently existent. Why? Because they're dependently existent. So if we can understand what do we mean by things being dependently existent, then we can understand better the idea of emptiness, because these are like two sides of a coin. So what I'd like to do now is have a look at what do we mean by things existing dependently? And on that basis, hopefully start to get a better appreciation of what really emptiness means. And we can talk about things being dependent arisings in three ways. That the first way in which things exist dependently is they exist depending on causes and conditions. For example, this laptop here exists depending on causes and conditions. One of the very first conditions necessary was someone needed to think about designing this laptop. And then, of course, all the various raw materials needed to be gathered. They needed to be refined. All the various components needed to be manufactured. All those components needed to be assembled. And then, of course, all the factories and people involved in the process also necessary. So without all of those causes and conditions, we wouldn't have the laptop here now. I think that's fairly straightforward. Things also exist depending on their parts. So again, this laptop exists depending on its parts. Because without the metal frame, the screen, the buttons, the electronic components, the battery, without all of these parts, there would be no laptop. So again, that's fairly straightforward. Everything exists depending on its parts. But remember, this idea here, that things are dependent, should be overturning our idea that things are independent. But I think most of us are quite happy to accept that this laptop exists depending on causes and conditions and its parts, and yet, at the same time, happy to accept that when we walk in the door, there's already a laptop sitting here on the table. True or not? Yeah. That shouldn't be possible according to this logic. So what's wrong? The logic is not wrong. What's wrong is that we don't really understand these at a deep level. We only understand them sort of fairly superficially. So to understand these at a deeper level, we have to go to the third way in which things are dependent. That things exist depending on labelling, conception, designation. These are all three words to mean the same thing. And so when we look at that, we think, oh yeah, I think I know what that means. It means we've got a thing here that we're calling a laptop. Again, that's a fairly superficial understanding of what we mean here. To try to understand what we really mean here, what we can understand is that when we look out on the world, we're just receiving a mass of sense data, particularly visual data. And of course we have to make some sense or meaning out of all of this stuff, otherwise we couldn't function. So what we do is we draw lines around various collections of data, and we create objects to make meaning. So we're very good line drawers to create meaning out of all of this stuff. But we need to do more than that, because we're not existing here in isolation, we exist with others. And if we want to be able to communicate, then on top of drawing lines and creating objects, we have to give them names so that we can communicate. So we need to do that. If we don't do that, we couldn't function. And we are constantly improving our ability to do this. We know from our own experience, when we go into a new situation we've never been before, we often look there and we go, what's that? We don't even know if it's one thing, a collection of things. We don't know how to draw the lines, and so we're sort of struggling to draw lines and create objects and give meaning. So we're continually improving our ability to do this so that we can get more meaning and function better in the world. How we divide up the world, of course, is not fixed. It's completely arbitrary, depending on the meaning that we want to get out of the world, what we experience. For example, how many things are there? How many things are there? Is there one star? 2 triangles? 6 triangles? 6 triangles and a hexagon? A collection of 18 lines? Or hundreds or thousands of dots? How many objects are here?
Endless.
We decide according to the meaning we want. So we could draw a single line around all of this, create one object and say, one star. Or we could draw 2 lines and say, 2 triangles over the top of each other. We decide how many objects are there. There's not a star there existing from its own side, independent of our conceptual framework. We create the star. The star only exists within our conceptual framework. There is no star to be found here from its own side in that basis. So that's what it means for things to be not findable. It means you will not find the object amongst the basis, because we create the object by drawing a line and giving a name. So the star only exists within our conceptual framework. There is no star to be found here in the basis, from its own side, independent of our conceptual framework. So often you'll find that's the meaning of not findable. And we also see a term called merely labelled. Merely means only, just. So things are merely labelled means things only exist within our conceptual framework. They do not exist independent of that. Things do not exist from their own side, independent of our conceptual framework. So this is what it means for things to be existing through labelling, conception, designation. Anyone have any questions about this? I have more to add, but...
So all things are merely labeled? All things existed by our...
This is what this statement is saying.
Yeah.
Is that nothing exists independently, everything is a dependent arising. Everything is merely labelled, yes. Everything only exists within that conceptual framework.
Mind included.
Yes, mind included.
Animal mind included.
Yes, everything. That's the assertion on this logic.
Is there any attention given to the fact that most people and creatures, even animals, would agree pretty much on the definition of these things? That most of them perceive it in very similar ways.
So again, as we saw before, we look at this, we go, yeah, that makes sense. I create the star. Yeah, sure. It only exists within my conceptual framework. The question is that how we relate to things?
Well, we define them, but the fact is that even though things are the way we've defined them, there is something common among human beings and even animals, and often from varied cultures where they do define things
Similar. Exactly.
So there's something in that definition.
It just means that as a species, it's useful to define things in a similar way to enhance our survival. Yes.
Well, it does say
And
something
communication.
also about the thing defined. Like
Does
it's
it?
imagination. I think it does, because it somehow elicits this response from a variety of different observers.
But that implies then that we could only perceive that in that one way.
No, but
No?
like that star, you can perceive it in 7 different ways, but everybody can see that you can do that. And people will agree to it.
Again, intellectually, that's probably true. But the point here is that how we relate to things? That's where the interesting question is. Yes, of course, intellectually we can understand, oh yes, I can see that as a star or 2 triangles. But when we relate to things in our life, do we relate to things as if they are existing within our conceptual framework? Or do we relate to things as if they existed from their own side?
But it's just
That's the question.
convention.
Huh?
It's just convention.
What? What's convention?
Relating to things as if they exist.
No, we're not talking about convention. We're talking about experience. Convention is intellectual. I'm talking experience. Experientially, when we see things and we relate to things, I don't think experientially we relate to them as things being merely labelled. If we did, the Buddhist assertion is we would never have any mental afflictions or suffering. We'd be liberated. That's the Buddhist assertion.
Well, why does all of humanity share this affliction?
Because we all have contaminated minds.
Isn't there something, and there's just something about how if something is the way it is, there must be a reason for it?
There's a reason for it.
So what?
What do you mean?
Well, if all human beings are X a certain way,
No, not
they
all.
would have to
No,
find some reason why that's so.
No, I mean we can change that. We can overcome that and see things correctly. We're not stuck there.
Why were we made like this? It's like the original sin in Christianity.
See, the thing is, with these sorts of questions, we always demand the beginning. When did it start?
Why this way?
But actually, if we just look at the physical world point, one of the fundamental principles of classical physics is the conservation of mass energy. You can't create it, you can't destroy it. So then when you talk about the origins of the universe, then it gets a bit tricky. You know, and then one of the most common theories now, of course, is Big Bang. But I think no classical physicist would say, oh, Big Bang means the universe popped into existence from nothing. That would violate the fundamental principles. So even in classical physics, there's no beginning. No beginning. Because then you say something comes from nothing. And that violates physics, and that violates the same principles in Buddhism. You can't have something coming from nothing. So there's no beginning.
Actually, say that there is something inherent in to say that there is something inherent in human beings which is flawed and causes suffering.
Inherent.
Built into the way human beings see things, think about things,
Our mind is contaminated, yes.
contaminated. It's sort of to say, well, let's try to evolve to be better than the given. Like to make some sort of concerted effort to overcome your built-in human limitations. Because the fact that it's not, most human beings suffer from these things. But this business is sort of, it's kind of the point, it's saying, okay, well, human beings have evolved as they have up until now.
Survival.
And we reach this point and we say, well, now, even though we have evolved unconsciously, without effort, now we're going to make an effort to change ourselves.
Not sure what you mean here. I mean, the Buddhist assertion, of course, is that we're stuck in this cycle. The Buddhist assertion is that we're stuck in this cycle life after life after life, not just this life. Of course, if we have an assumption that our mind begins at the beginning of this life, then these sorts of questions could say, well, why?
Well, if there's no self, then what's
No.
reincarnated?
I'm going to answer that tomorrow morning. That's coming tomorrow morning.
Well, I don't want to hug this thing.
Yeah, over here.
First, I would like to reply to you. If you look at modern psychology or Darwinism, there is a reason for everything. It's survival, it's the continuation of degeneration, right? If you see a rope, at the beginning you would think it is a snake, right? So you get all anxious and run away. So there's a reason why you're doing things, why you get angry, why there. So of course Buddhism and modern science do not always
Buddhism is a
agree.
little bit like psychotherapy. If you say,
Yes.
well, the way human beings are is a defense mechanism that's not very functional.
Right.
Something like that. And then Buddhism would be like psychotherapy, saying, well, you have to get rid of this defense mechanism because it's just hurting you.
Exactly.
That's what you say.
And then I want to comment about the universe out of nothing. So if you look today at modern physics, very modern physics, actually says there is no such thing as nothing. Even a vacuum is not a vacuum. And you talked about modern, they call it science. Even in a vacuum, particles are being created and destroyed all the time.
Mm-hmm.
The summation is always zero.
Mm-hmm.
So there is no such thing as emptiness or nothing or void.
Yeah, but emptiness is not, doesn't mean that.
Not this emptiness.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sure.
What we envision as nothing.
Sure. I mean, we can talk about dark matter and dark energy and stuff,
Yeah.
of course.
So things can be created according to quantum physics.
Quantum physics, well, that's a different story. I don't want to go there because I don't know it very well.
You know the experiment where the gorillas come across the gorillas come across in a movie, and you don't know?
Yeah, I know.
Okay, there's this experiment that people have done where they're showing a movie, and then all of a sudden some gorillas come across, and most people don't see them. Okay, most of the people do not see them. They don't exist for them. Yet, if you show the movie really, really slowly, then everybody sees them.
Mm-hmm.
Somehow that popped up when you're talking about this, that there's something there that some people see and some people don't. Or also the story where the primitive Indians or something didn't see the boats coming on the thing because they had no experience of what a boat is. That came up when you do the star movie. Like, if we never knew what a star was, would we not?
Yeah, maybe we wouldn't create a single thing. I don't know. Who knows?
Okay.
Yeah, possible.
So, is it true to say that from Buddhist perspective, if a tree is falling and no one is hearing it or seeing it, it has
The interesting question is who is the me who's asking that question? See, the thing is, often people ask this question, but if we all walk out the room, won't there still be a laptop here?
No, I'm asking.
Yeah, I know. So the answer is that often when people ask these questions, they ask the questions with a false assumption that there's an independent me here that's walking out the room. If that's your assumption, of course there's a laptop here on the table when you walk out the door. Of course.
Okay, because
So the question... No, I'm just saying that when we ask these questions, we have to look at our assumptions that are often built into the questions. So there are a number of questions that philosophers asked Buddha like this, and he actually refused to answer them. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because he saw that there was a false assumption built into the question, and whatever he said would just increase the confusion of the person who asked the question.
So basically what you're saying that there is a limit of question because if you reach some questions that are too contaminated by ignorance, you have to meditate on it. Like there is a limit to.
No, I mean you can ask questions, but what I'm saying is that you have to be aware of any assumptions that you bring into the question. That's all. And often we ask questions with these assumptions without knowing that we've got those assumptions in the question. So if we are aware of any assumptions, then we can phrase the question in a way where we can get some sort of useful answer to help us go further. That's all. That's all. Okay. What I'd like to do, we've got a bit of time before the break, is based on this idea now, let's go back here and have a look at these two ideas and see if we can understand what we mean by causes and conditions and parts, maybe at a little bit deeper level. So this is a timeline, this is a seed, and this is the plant that it produces. So we say the plant exists depending on causes and conditions. The underlying cause of the plant is the seed. The conditions are the soil, sunlight, water, fertilizer, and so on. So with those causes and conditions, we can have the plant, the seed producing the plant. Now, the question is, at what point does the seed become the plant? And remember, we grasp onto things as existing independent of us. If things exist independent of us, then it should be a fixed, obvious point where the seed becomes the plant. So, where is the point where the seed becomes the plant in this process?
There is no seed, there is no plant,
There is a seed and plant.
Really? No, I'm not at the top of the
There is a seed and there's a plant. There is a seed and a plant.
No, but you see, the seed it's a name we give to something, and the tree it's a name we give to something.
Sure.
And there is something there. There is no seed, there is just something there.
Let's keep it simple. There is a seed and there is a plant. We're going to talk more about this. There is a seed and plant. Of course,
Merely labeled.
yeah. I mean, of course, what you're saying, yeah, right. But now, instinctively, we don't relate to things as being merely labelled, do we?
Yeah, of course.
So, my assumption is, instinctively, there's a seed there existing from its own side independent of us. There's a plant there existing from its own side independent of us. At what point does that seed become the plant?
The minute we see it.
When we declare that it becomes
Yes, that's right. What we can understand, in fact, is that the point where the seed becomes a plant is the point where this configuration of data stops looking like our concept of seed and starts looking like our concept of plant. And all of us have slightly different concepts of seed and plant. So for some of us it may be here, for some here, for some here, for some here. We decide when the plant comes into existence. It doesn't exist from its own side. We bring it into existence. Now here's another point, another question that could be helpful, is we say that the seed and plant are in a cause-effect relationship. And if two things are in a cause-effect relationship, By definition, it means they cannot exist at the same time, by definition. The question is, does the seed stop existing before the plant comes into existence? So don't think about it, you'll think about it. Does the seed stop existing before the plant comes into existence? There can only be two answers, yes or no. If you say no, that means the seed is existing at the same time as the plant.
That's right.
And it cannot, by definition, if two things are in a cause and effect relationship, they cannot exist at the same time. So no is illogical. So then if you say yes, the seed has ceased to exist, where does the plant come from? So both no and yes are both illogical. So cause and effect, with the assumption that things are existing independently, becomes completely illogical. It cannot work. It cannot work. And so there's the great Indian master Nagarjuna from the 2nd century has a classic text on emptiness called Mula Madhyamika Karika, or Fundamental Wisdom of Middle Way. And in that text he wrote, he has 27 chapters of argument saying, you believe in independent existence? What about cause and result? Agent and action, fire and fuel. How do these things work? They can't. They become illogical. So these sorts of arguments can help us to break down the false belief that things exist from their own side. They exist independently.
Sorry, so how can there be a cause and an effect if it's all depends on our labeling of it? If the reality of things is depending on me saying that's a tree and me saying that's a seed, then how can we still, then there is no cause and effect.
Cause and effect is a concept that we have developed as well, on top of seeds and plants, to help understand this, the process. So that's another useful concept, cause and result.
So it's all
Okay,
about
so
cause.
it's a part of, so it's part of our ignorance.
No.
Why not?
No.
Very
So-
effective way of talking about it.
Sorry?
It's just not a very effective idea to describe this situation.
No.
The words aren't appropriate. Cause and effect
It's
are not
fine.
useful when talking about this.
Why are they not useful?
Because you're talking about something which is transforming.
But don't we say that the seed produces the plant? Isn't that
Not
our,
really.
isn't that our convention?
No, the seed is transformed into
Isn't
the
it?
plant.
Yeah, but isn't the plant the result of the seed?
Not just, also the sun, the earth, the water.
Not the result, they're conditions. They're the conditions.
It's just semantics.
Correct, exactly. And it's useful semantics to help us function in the world, and if we knew that experientially, there'd be no problem. The problem is we don't realise it's just semantics. We think that there's a real independent seed producing a real independent plant, experientially. Intellectually, we may appreciate 100%, it's just semantics. But that's not how we behave. That's the problem.
You're implying that the seed does something to make the plant.
No, it transforms into the
Seed
plant.
is transformed into
Correct.
the plant.
That's what we mean by cause and result. It transforms into realm. That's what it means. For something to be the substantial cause of something, it transforms into the result.
Child produce the adult.
Yeah, the child transforms into the adult.
Yeah,
Exactly.
make it.
Yeah, so the adult is the result coming from the child to the adult. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So it's the same idea. So again, you're right, it's semantics, but it's useful semantics. It helps us to understand what's going on. But again, the problem is we don't experientially see things like that. That's the problem. We experientially see things as completely independent of us. That's the problem.
So according to what you say, a child, before he learns to speak, he understands the world better than...
No.
Because he doesn't have a word to define the seed or a plant. He just experiences it as it without words. So he understands the reality...
No. Because the child,
Before he doesn't know anything.
when they're born, they can't even really draw a line on anything. They can't even distinguish themselves from the world. They have no ability or very limited ability to draw any lines, to make any useful distinctions.
Okay, so let's example someone he doesn't learn to speak. He just grow up by experiencing the life.
And then they start drawing lines and giving some concept